The live stream now. I will check my phone. Got a good team making sure everything's working. Liz and Brian are constantly. Pretty good.
I like Brian. Character. I like Brian. We're going to go get a seat.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Just starting the streaming, so we're on camera now.
I'm going to sit behind the camera.
Yeah, I get that. And I'm not. I like that. Thanks. The whole thing So I would
Really?
One of those each Monday, Tuesday event, Halloween for spaghetti and meatball. And I got it, I think, I don't need to eat this. I'll give them some.
Thank you.
Here we go, John.
Right on. A whole bunch of seats down front. Join us down there.
So our Friday goes today.
Yeah, well, I don't know if Jim and his friend are gonna sit down. I was hoping to get these four for us.
I'll put two up in back here. I presume that you're all excited about the potential develop more land and all that stuff.
Oh, I would love to sell a couple of plots myself. Yeah, right on my land. Yeah.
You can run for mayor?
No, I think it would kill me. My stomach couldn't take it. I'd have a stroke.
Being mayor, or having mayor we got.
How you doing?
Being mayor, I don't tolerate that kind of stuff much at all. I get too angry.
That's what having a mayor we got.
Yeah, I know, but I've just learned through the years that I do not do that kind of stuff well at all.
Oh, you did great. Yeah. I gotta go sit down.
Well, you want to go forward?
Yeah, it's fine. There's not going to be an opportunity.
We are recording and streaming this meeting, so the camera's here, so just so you're aware.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Yeah.
It may pick up your audio. Once we're,
It's one of those, thank you for saying that.
Little camera.
so it's going now.
We were someplace else.
Oh.
She's good. She's we're dragging ourselves up this way. She's not here. That's why we were talking about why she's doing. Pauline would be ready for her house is
Thanks for coming tonight. It's a few minutes after 6, so we want to get started, get people out of here and back to their busy lives afterwards. I'm Eric Cousins, Planning and Permitting Director for City of Auburn. We have John Blaze, Deputy Director of Planning and Permitting for the city, with extensive experience in soils and wastewater disposal as well as phosphorus control in multiple watersheds. And we have David Rope that we don't get to work with all that often, but David is helping us with this overall project. David is a retired state soil scientist, the state soil scientist for a number of years. He's a licensed site evaluator and soil scientist still, and really is an expert in soils, an expert in wastewater disposal, and well regarded, not only throughout the state, but throughout New England and other parts of the country. We're really pleased to have him helping us with this project. Back in December, city staff put forward a list of comprehensive plan recommendations to the city council for them to prioritize which ones we work on first. They asked us to take this one as kind of a second phase. We've been working on some other zoning changes with the planning board. And we're looking to get this discussion started tonight, really with the meeting that is intended to connect with the primary stakeholders in the Lake Auburn watershed. Now, obviously, everybody that lives in the watershed is a stakeholder. This is not intended to be the biggest public meeting of this discussion. It really is intended to connect with the Auburn Water District, Lewiston Water District, Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission, and also an opportunity. Public certainly welcome. We want to hear feedback and questions at the end after an overview. But also just to, we didn't have a lot of advance notice for this meeting, and part of that is because it really is intended to connect with those stakeholders that invited. So thank you for coming. There is a lot of information in the presentation. Please consider it. We've had a lot of people call in the last week or so that haven't really wanted to take the time to understand it, listen to the possibility of improving watershed quality. Also potentially building systems that are better for homeowners, for wastewater disposal and phosphorus control, longer lasting systems that are cost effective for the homeowner, but also providing better treatment. And I think we rarely have a planning discussion that we don't have to try to balance some people gaining and some people losing. But I hope, take the information that we'll be presenting. I think this is an opportunity where people with all interests within the watershed, landowners, watershed protection, people trying to develop their lots or preserve their lots. I think there's an opportunity to do this better than we have been and really have winners on every front. We encourage you to take the information, provide feedback, talk to somebody that is a site evaluator, that is a civil engineer. Ask them about the science of what will be presented tonight. And I think you'll find that it sort of speaks for itself that we have an opportunity here to change the way we've been doing things and improve the quality of Lake Auburn, while at the same time giving some flexibility to grow. With that, John Blaze will walk you through the presentation.
Thank you, Eric. I think the most important thing here as we go down through the agenda, this is really a discussion about water quality. It's not a discussion about how much development is going to be potentially going to be in the watershed. It's about water quality and specifically addressing what we think is a potential impact from existing septic systems, and then potentially new septic systems. So and we're really going to talk about the science and the engineering of that specifically. But on top of that, there's outside things that are creating pressures on that. And that's the urgency to really address some of the things that the state is starting to push down with new LDs. We're going to go down through those. And then really talk about the science and what we're doing today. What are some of the designs that have gone in 2021 and how can we make it better? But so again, the agenda, sense of urgency, right? We can't wait on protection of what our public water supply for Auburn. I think that's the most important piece here, right? So this is a best management practice to help the lake. Also, we want to have a guiding team to adopt and guide the ordinance update. If we move this forward, there may be other discussions that may stem additional development. We want everybody at the table to be part of that discussion. So I want to identify our scope, our stakeholders. What is the vision and the strategy? Why and how? Right. So we had the 2010 watershed study that the Lake Auburn Water District had done. Most recently in 2021, the City of Auburn did one. That's where we got a lot of vision and a lot of our strategy on how we're going to protect the lake. So that's where a lot of this information is being driven by. And then the understanding and the buying, right? So this is all the technical information. That's why we've got Dave here today. Before I got involved in government work, I spent 10 years as a consultant for working for a small engineering firm. We did a lot of septic designs. We probably did about 300 a year. So I've probably been involved with thousands of septic designs. This was something that I could really lend my expertise in helping this community with their public water supply. So we just want to kind of combine some of what we have for in-house and then use our stakeholders and at the end get a better product for the drinking water supply and the end user, person that lives in the watershed for their own septic system. So, and then lastly, whatever we propose, whatever we decide on as a group or the council approves, we want to follow the impacts. Or we want to follow the science, we want to follow the engineering, and we want to document it and see what the impacts truly are, right? So sometimes there's always an instance where we may make a bad decision but we need to identify it quick and we need to make a change. So I think documenting the change as we implement new best management practices, in particular for septic systems, and implementing what's considered low impact development techniques for development in the watershed, we need to track that, right? Not only for what's new, but what is existing and what is being replaced. So there's a couple of things there that we're gonna track. But so the urgency, again, we talked a little bit about it, drinking water, the waiver from filtration, right? Those were one of 10 communities, public water supplies in the state. That's good stuff in terms of the ability to bring drinking water to the public without having to go through a filtration system. I think that's great. So then development pressures, LD 1884, right? This is coming down from the state. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then existing lots, right? There's over 300 existing lots in the watershed. What are those impacts? What do those systems look like? And then again, this one here may be a little bit difficult in our conversation, but there's some people out there that may feel like there is some land use discrimination. So, having the ability for everybody to develop their lot sustainably may be part of this conversation. I'm going to really emphasize tonight, though, the emphasis is septic design. And what we're going to be pushing through for an ordinance change with the council and the planning board is the specific language in the ordinance that is around septic system design. We're not talking about allowing more development in the ag zone, allowing more development in the watershed. It's specifically around septic system design and those standards. Here's a little graph. This is from 1997 to 2013. This is a measurement out of the 2010 report, right? So this is showing that water quality has been getting poorer and poorer in Lake Auburn. It's not necessarily from the new development or proposed development, it's from what we have boots on the ground today. So in 2013, they got to a point where they had to apply a treatment for water quality. So this is a measurement, NTU, turbidity measurement, 0 here, 5 being the red line. That's at a point where a waiver is being threatened. So as we can see, if we stay status quo today, we're heading in a bad trajectory. So I think that's important. Next slide.
You only did the old one, how about the 2021?
It's just a point. It's a talking point. It's just a talking point. So this year, and again, this is really just this is coming down from the state in terms of pressure. within Auburn itself specifically, there's a lot of pressures, outside pressures on increased housing opportunity in Maine. So, and this is just basically some of the information, reviewing data on what the study, what the legislature talked about in the resolve in 2021. This is not very recent. Legislative resolve and report that came out that said that they're gonna study housing shortages, state laws that affect local regulations on housing. These are outside pressures, right? Review efforts on other states and municipalities to address housing shortages throughout changes to zoning and land use restrictions. This is something that is not being done at the local level. This is something that's being done at the state level that could affect Auburn as a community that we may not have any say in. Yeah, I understand that, but there's outside situations where it could potentially impact the city of Auburn that's outside of our local control. So, next slide. These are some of the recommendations that came out of that. I'm bringing this to light just so people understand that a lot of this effort that the city's putting forth, that we're putting forth, is really kind of to play defense if there's going to be additional impacts to our community that's outside of our control. So some of these recommended recommendations: allowing accessory dwelling units by right in all zoning districts currently zoned for single family homes. So the ADUs, there's already been an LD 1312 that's already been affected by this. That could potentially, and we're going to get a legal opinion on that, that could affect even some family homes that are in the ag zone. And so again, this is already passed by the legislature. It's already something that the city has to deal with in terms of interpretation and potential impacts to development within the city. In the it's unprecedented. These votes, from on both sides of the party, you're having all 15 people in this committee agree on this. So it's got a lot of bipartisan support. But I talked about this stuff only to let people understand that it's not just the city itself, but there could be outside pressures that we have to respond. Now, I'm trying, as a planner, I'm trying to plan for what's our best fence. Or specifically, right now, we're talking about public water supply for the communities of Auburn and Lewis. I won't read down through them, but there's a lot of recommendations here that potentially could impact the city. Next slide. 1884. We just heard that they had a meeting at the beginning of this week. They had a public hearing on it. There was a lot of people for, a lot of people against. They hadn't had a workshop yet, but they're still talking about it. The legislature hasn't voted on it yet. This is something, again, that could come down, that could affect our community. And this is kind of a summary of what the bill is potentially brought forth. So this is the watershed numbers currently right now. So, and I'm talking about, when I'm talking about watershed numbers, we're talking about, these are septic systems in the watershed. So the watershed around Lake Auburn, right? The green that we're looking at is already protected land. That's a good thing. But particularly, of the 321 wastewater units, right? There's 275. There's 275 systems that only need to meet the minimum state standards.
2010 isn't right. We need to go up to the study that was actually just finished, and I have it right here on my phone. Why aren't you going up to that? This is not a talking point. This, you need to, with all your data, not just 2010.
There's, okay, so there may be more systems between 2010 and 2020. But there's not a lot of data there in terms of development in the watershed. We're talking about septic systems, existing septic systems. That's really the focus of the conversation today. And what I'm saying is that of the 321 systems, right, from 2010 to the 1700s, there's 275 systems that are being installed to the state minimum standards, which is 9 inches. And I'll have some examples of that. Next slide. So these are some of the recommendations from the 2021 report. Align the septic systems regulations contained in the Lake Auburn Watershed Overlay District Ordinance with the best available science in Maine septic system regulations. So that's why we've got Dave here, and we're going to go through that. What are we proposing? Right? Develop a clear set of standards for farm management that will limit phosphorus loading for commercial and agricultural activities. We do have a small text change. We are going to share that with the group. That will be something that we are going to be presenting to the planning board. And then we're incorporating low impact development requirements for new single family residential developments. And we're already started that. We already have the conversation around updating the 2016 manual. We already started that conversation. We've got a recommendation from the planning board already that's now going to council. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Other recommendations, right? Cities to increase density in other areas of community. Auburn right now, urban residential, we're looking to go to form-based code. We're looking to do that. We're looking to increase density in other parts of the community to create less pressure on the north end within the watershed. We want to foster a working relationship with our stakeholders. We want the water district, Lewiston, Auburn water districts, the Watershed Protection Commission, we want them part of this discussion. We want people in the watershed part of this discussion. We want the community to be part of the discussion. We want to continue to support some of the restrictions that are in the lake. We want to support implementations of best management practices. And specifically here, we're talking about septic system design, septic system soils, and what's best for the environment. The city also supports Youth Conservation Corps, doing small projects in the watershed every summer, right? So our local kids get a good understanding of what water quality is, what a watershed means, and how that affects them for drinking water. And then lastly, this is coming out of our comp plan, our 2010 comp plan updates. City recommends larger lot frontages in the low density country residential lots. So bigger lots, less ability to develop. So these are some of the recommendations that have come out of the reports and have been basically identified as what we consider maybe potentially low hanging fruit. So here's some of the specific language. And basically what we're saying is that right now, currently, in the watershed, you need 36 inches to the limiting factor. And Dave will be able to talk to this a little more fluidly than I can. But what that is that where is the seasonal water table, right? So that's a measurement. The limiting factor is where the seasonal water table is established in the soil, right? There's usually some laying, there's usually some watermarks in the soil. And you can, as a site evaluator, when you go out there and you take your test bits, you're figuring out where this water table is. And currently, right now, you gotta have 36 inches in the watershed. And you can set that system basically 1 foot below the existing grade. Now, and we've got some examples of that. And essentially, what that does is that brings you closer to the seasonal high water mark and seasonal water table that could lead into leaching into the groundwater. So that's it in a nutshell. I know they did do a great job of explaining that, but we've got some diagrams. Dave will talk a little bit about that, but I'm just going to go through the changes. Right. So what we're suggesting is 12 inches to the limiting factor rather than 36. I know that's a big change, right? But in addition to that, having at least, we're going to bring in 24 inches of suitable natural soil or fill material below the bottom of the disposal field. So we're going to have 12 inches. We're going to bring in 24 more inches of material. So we're going to have that 36 inches of horizontal separation from the seasonal high water table. That additional 24 inches is really specified media that does a good job of treatment, right? Currently, right now, those areas that have 36 inches typically is very well drained soil. The treatment there is not very good. I'm going to let Dave talk a little bit about the treatment part and the science and the engineering behind that. But I'll just say that no matter what, right? If it's a replacement system, if it's one of those, remember those 320 or 275 systems that are eligible for replacement? It's not to the state standard. We're suggesting that everybody replaces the new standard at 36 inches. This is the text change. This is what we're suggesting, right? And then in addition to that, all disposal areas, replacement and new, shall meet the new section. This is the new section of 60-952. So this is the new section. You're going to have 36 inches of separation between the bottom of the disposal field and the limiting factor, right? We talked a little bit about the limiting factor. That's where the seasonal high water table is, right? We're going to have 36 inches in that design and that construction. No, both. Yes, even grandfather. All disposal system areas. This is the suggested language. All disposal areas, replacement or new, shall meet section 60-952 design criteria. Now, if the replacement systems cannot meet this, right? There may be some small but non-conforming lots. We're not saying that the house can't have a septic system. Obviously, there are going to be conditions when we can't address that. The local plumbing inspector must evaluate the design with concurrence from the Auburn Water District to impart as much of the design criteria into the replacement system. So we're going back, right? Every system in the watershed already has approval from Auburn Water District. That's already kind of a systematic thing that we have set up. But now when we have a criteria where we can't meet it, we're going to go, this local site evaluation, the local plumbing inspector, which is our code enforcement officer, is going to go back to the Auburn Water District and say, what's the best we can do? This is what we can do. And we all got to sign off on it. Right? I'm sorry? I think you have to have a system. No matter what, at the end of the day, you got to have a replacement system. You may not get the 36 inches of horizontal separation. Mostly in small non-conforming lots, you have a fill extension. So you have elevations and then you have a fill extension that extends out beyond the area. You may not be able to get a 3-foot rise on it for a mounted system. You may be at 2 feet, but we're going to hopefully add some media. We're going to do the best we can to make that site work, right? It's not gonna be, it's not gonna be a tremendous amount of cost. I would not, I wouldn't say that it's a $30,000 system.
Fine. I had done that. Could be, depending on.
We're talking about in the watershed that where you already have a 36-inch requirement. So we're only talking about 1 foot of media addition, right? Because now you can set that system in the ground 1 foot. So now you only get 24 inches of horizontal separation. But what we're asking about is, what we're asking the delta is in 1 foot. And I think you get a better product at the end of the day. You're going to get a system that lasts. So in addition to that, we're going to have a curtain drain. Curtain drains. What is a curtain drain? So a curtain drain is on the. So let's say this is our septic field, right? And you've got slope that goes this way, right? And so there could be a lot of groundwater that comes off here. So a curtain drain or a diversion ditch would be installed on the uphill side to protect that field, right? We don't want infiltration, hydraulic condition to change that field. So what we're saying, what we're suggesting is that we're going to install a curtain drain, and we're going to install a drainage ditch, or maybe the combination of the two, depending on the condition and what's assigned by the licensed site evaluator at the time. But that again will be a requirement. I can say that I've been part of a design on multiple engineered septic systems. Those are larger septic systems, and specifically they're we're involved in the Belgrade Lakes in particular. And they have very sensitive watersheds there as well. And there were big recreational camps with high water use. Every single system that we designed when we were out in that watershed had a curtain drain installed. We wanted to protect the investment for the sport, for the camps, for the youth camps, high kid numbers, really high uses of effluent in the summertime, and we wanted to protect that investment. And at the same time, not necessarily just protect the investment for the camp, but protect the water quality, which in turn is the biggest return, right? Having good water quality is why the camps are there. So that's another part of I would consider this best management. Again, going back to the term best management practices, this is part of best management practices. Sure. So most right. So, but if the septic system is failing, you got to put a new one in. If it's not, then we're not going to do anything. And we're not requiring anybody to do it. This is for replacement systems and new systems. Yes, correct. Correct. This is specifically for water.
Is there going to be, I think that I did not know that. I'm just gonna throw out, maybe there's some ways to help people. Think about something.
I think that they're, through community development, that's another city program. I think there has to be some thought into that. I think you bring up a great point. But right now, as planning and permitting and code, we're ordinance driven folks. We're We're the policy, and this is where the policy is written. We're at the policy writing level right now in the public discussions, but what you're bringing up is an important part of the discussion. But not, right now, it's not specific on that. More about this text change. And then lastly, here's the last piece, right? This is important too. And this is what's going on in the community right now in the watershed. All private sewage disposal systems shall be installed in the lot of the dwelling, right? Installed in the lot where the dwelling is. Unless the system can be developed outside the watershed or under special conditions, replacement systems may be approved by the local plumbing inspector on adjacent lots. So hold on. So right now we have potential for development out there in the watershed, and that specific lot may not have it, but it could be two lots down, and they have what's called a septic field. Multiple septic systems concentrated in the watershed. That's not good for water quality. We want to stop that. We want to stop that in its tracks. So again, I think that these are really well thought out. You know, when the council came to me, and I told Eric, I said, Eric, we can knock this out of the park. We're going to protect the lake. This is about protecting the lake. This is about getting your line ready when we're on the 5-yard line and we know that they're coming. We're gonna get the line ready. We're getting the line ready. Because there could be outside pressures that if we don't have this stuff in place, if we don't do these things, you saw that NTU thing, that trajectory is just going to continue going up. And I think that this is a great way to solve that issue. It's basically it's a nano refractory light. Basically, it's the amount of reflective. It's a measurement of refractive light of suspended solids in a water column. And what that is it could be a multitude of things. It could be soil, small particles, could be plankton, it could be bacteria. It's a combination of things. Yeah, second dish is basically the measurement down to the bottom of the lake, water clarity. This is really a more scientific measurement of refracted light. So if you think about like Eric's bottle of water, this has got a NTU of 0 essentially. And then if I took this water and I took some mud and I put it in there and I shook it around, that might have an NTU measurement of 10 or 100. Kind of give you an idea. And really that's contaminants. At the end of the day, it's contaminants. It could be measured as phosphorus, it could be measured as nitrogen, NO2, nitrates, whatever it is, bacteria. Yes.
Can you briefly explain why our
Excuse me?
that you want to eliminate adjacent rated as property?
Right, so what that's going to do is going to minimize the amount of developed watershed. So we want, if they can't put it on, if they can't put it on that particular lot, right, and it's not a replacement system, then that's not a suitable place to have development. Right, we don't want to concentrate. We don't want to concentrate the septic fields. Could not.
Like Dan or 5.
Right, that could not happen in the future.
Oh, so it's not the water quality work.
No, it's basically the concentration of wastewater in a specific spot. So again, going back to the original thought that 30 inches, 36 inches of limiting factor is good. And I'm going to have Dave talk a little bit about the soils on that. We're finding out that 36 inches is a well-drained soil. And that's really not, there's not a lot of treatment happening there, right? The science and the engineering is not working. So we really want, we like the 12-inch sites. We like the different types of soils, and Dave's going to talk a little bit about that. Next slide.
John, if we can summarize the questions from the audience, because people at home were not able to hear that.
Okay. So this is for the phosphorus ordinance section 60-1070, the text amendment. This is just updating the new DEP manual, design manual. Currently, right now, our code is 1990. We're identifying it, the updated one of March 2016. I wanted you to talk a little bit about this because this incorporates those low impact development techniques, right? These are some of the areas that it's the best, it's probably some on a good site, it's probably the best way to really treat for phosphorus control on any development in the watershed. It implements some of the use of low impact development techniques. We talked a little bit about curtain drains and diversion ditches, level lip spreaders. These are low impact development techniques, right? And then this focuses on point source infiltration, where we're not concentrating the whole lot and then sending it to a pond. We're doing a little treatment here, a little treatment here, a little treatment here. We're distributing the storm water. Simple physics, spreading the load out. So this is good. This is good science. This is good for the watershed. I just wanted to let you know that we've already had a favorable recommendation from the planning board, and then this is now going to council.
I think one of the big differences from how we've been doing it, which we don't think has been working well based on the turbidity in Lake Auburn, is the way we were doing it is there was a phosphorus budget figured for each watershed, Lake Auburn and Taylor Pond. And then based on the number of acres that you owned within that watershed, you were allowed to generate a certain amount of phosphorus per acre. This requires treatment essentially from drop one of new rainwater that you're shedding from your site. So I think there's a huge opportunity with this, even standing alone, to provide improvements to water quality in the watershed by requiring low impact development standards. Instead of just saying, you have 10 acres, you can create more impervious and discharge more stormwater than the person next door that has 3 acres.
Yeah, got it. Right. Right. We're talking about each septic system based on the design can be different, right? So if you use concrete chambers in there, H20 loading, you can drive over it. That number might be upwards to 30,000. You have a lot of really poor soils, we can bring in sand. That may bring it to 30. There's all kinds. You might have a pump station that might bring it to 30,000. Potentially could, a very small percentage, but potentially could. But I'd say it's a very small percentage.
We can certainly, as we continue this discussion, tonight was really intended to talk about the science with stakeholders that are directly impacted. We could certainly have systems designed to meet each standard and get quotes from contractors.
This is a little bit of low impact development techniques, just some examples. This is right out of Westbrook's low impact development techniques. This is what they're using. And again, this is from that stormwater management design manual that we've been talking about. So those are just examples of what you could do. that could improve the stormwater and the impervious treatment on your site. Next slide. Again, where do we get some of this information from? This was the 2021 report. This is just some recommended septic design standards that they had referenced. This was more of an idea, but this is a lot of the text recommending maintaining a requirement for a minimum depth of 36 inches above the constraining layer of groundwater or bedrock. So this is what we're proposing. Next slide. Okay.
Good evening, folks. Before I start, I just wanted to preface that the reason I'm here today is not because I'm a hired gun. I retired as a state soil scientist. For 34 years, I was hired by the Maine Soil and Water Conservation Commission. Some of you may have heard of soil and water conservation districts. Well, that organization oversaw their formation and oversaw their functions and duties, and that was a big part of what I did when I worked. But my whole life career basically has been a passion of soil and water conservation. I don't have a shingle. I'm not a consultant. Somebody calls me up that knows of me, and it's a subject that I think makes sense and I believe in. It's doing the right thing that I say, okay, and if it isn't, I don't do it. I don't need the money. I do it because it's something I believe in. So I want you to understand that. But that's why I'm here today. I think they're on the right track of something that has a problem. And as a way of explaining, for instance, in the state of Maine, because we're such new soils geologically, 10,000 years may not sound like very recent to most people, but geologically it's fairly new. So our soils haven't weathered very deeply. They were compacted by the glacier. So we have these hard pans and bedrock and water tables that are not very deep. And it makes it challenging when you want to design septic systems or do other things. For the most part, if you can find a soil that has 36 inches to hard pan bedrock or water table, it's going to be in sand and gravels, which is like this particular site here. And as a soil scientist, we have A, B, and C horizons. A being the topsoil layer. B is something kind of transitionary. And then C is down into just plain sand and gravel. Those are primarily the soils that are going to meet what's in your ordinance today. There are a few others that are not just sand and gravel, but not in. So when that ordinance requires a septic system to be put into the ground, at least a foot or 2 feet, you're putting the bottom of it down into clean sand and gravel, there's nothing happening. The biologically active zone in most soils is within the upper 6 inches to a foot. Below that, there's not a lot going on. And when septic system design first kind of developed in most countries, including the United States and Maine, the main emphasis was getting rid of the water. That's why they did a perk test. You poured water into a hole in the ground, if it disappeared, perk, so that's a good site. And so you just got rid of the water because if it sat on the surface, it's pathogens, it's not a good thing. And then over time, they started thinking, maybe we need to think a little bit more about this. And so environmental standards started moving in. And I have been a licensed site evaluator for like 45 years. I was a state site evaluator for several years. I worked in the state septic system program. And a fair amount of the septic system rules you'll find today, I helped write. And I inserted in it a bunch of standards that I thought improved the design of septic systems considerably. One of the biggest movements in this state and in fact in the country is understanding that you want to put a septic system basically on top of the ground and shallow versus in the ground if you want water quality. Because that zone on the top, and you can see even in sand and gravels, it's a finer textured soil. So you've got fine textured soils, you've got microbes, you've got plant roots. You're going to get a lot of renovation of that wastewater. You put it into the sea horizon, Nothing happens to it. Everything in it goes right down to the groundwater table. Now you get an issue. I made this argument 15 years ago to some of these same bodies when I first got involved. I came at the request of a site evaluator to look at a property that they said, I think it makes the minimum standard, and they wanted to be sure that they didn't get in trouble. Then when I found out, yeah, and I could see what was going on, I said, there's basically going to be no treatment in this thing. It's just going to get rid of the water. It's not very good environmentally. So if you do put systems shallow on top of the ground, you're making a vast improvement. The other thing is, in the sand and gravel like this, when you hit the water table, it's probably an aquifer. It's a lot of water. In a soil like this one here, this is a typical soil in Maine. It's got a hard pan. Up where that olive color starts under the yellowish brown B horizon, there's an A, B, and then the C. That hard pan has a little bit of water pushed on it in spring and fall. That's, if you were to impact that with a septic system, it's really almost nothing, because it's a very small amount of water that's going through a fine textured soil. It dries up, and the plants take it up, and it's not a big deal. This is a big deal, and this is what most of these systems are probably being installed in today. And these don't pass muster when environmentally they're far superior. So I think what's being proposed here is definitely moving in the right direction of looking at environmental concerns as well as the quality of the water and treatment of the wastewater. And I did have another slide in here I wanted to show you, just because it's got pretty colors. There's too much light on it here. You see it well, but typically we have soils like this in the forest. All the biologic activities of this organic dumping right here, there's nothing going on here. So if you want treatment in these soils, you want to be able to have that biologically active zone of the plant roots are. They will keep taking up nutrients. The pathogens will die because it's aerobic, and they can last indefinitely. But if you put them deep in the ground, I'm working with the town of Biddeford on Biddeford Pool, Wyndham, Highland Lake. I work with the Belgrade Lakes Alliance, which is now the Seven Lakes Alliance. So I work with a whole bunch of people trying to help people understand things that they don't, such as this and phosphorus, and the best ways to address them. So that is my purpose here today. And it's a kind of a technical subject, but I think you understand the basics. Treat the wastewater, and if you build it on top of the ground, it doesn't have to be all that terribly expensive, because remember, if the groundwater table is at 24 inches, that means only a foot of fill before you put the leach field. It's only if it's at 12 inches that you have 2 feet of fill in it. So does that cover what you wanted me to? I guess I could answer questions if they have any. Yeah.
David, just for the folks at home,
Okay.
the question is, can David comment on anaerobic versus aerobic systems?
Yeah. All systems are hopefully aerobic and not anaerobic. But what happens is when the wastewater goes into a septic tank, there's too much biologic activity, so it becomes anaerobic. The wastewater goes from the septic tank into the leach field. And if you get particles of the soil plugged up by microbes and particles, it's anaerobic on the surface, but underneath it, it's aerobic. And so the pathogens are still attacked aerobically. If you want to introduce oxygen into the septic tank or the drain field, you'll get less of this biologic mat forming, and the wastewater can then move through the soil quicker. I have mixed feelings personally on that, because that biologic mat is where a lot of treatment occurs in the waste, in the septic system. And if you get advanced treatment that eliminates any of that biologic matter, then things like viruses, which are very small, and nutrients just can go right straight down to the ground because there's nothing to slow them down. So a biomat can be useful, but if you happen to have like restaurants or something that has a lot of BOD suspended solids, sometimes you have to add that into it. And that can help bring back a system that failed because people use too much water. But generally speaking, I think the standard septic systems used properly is probably the best system you can have in my room. Any other questions?
David, one question. The ditch lines that go down to what I call the septic farm up in my house. Isn't there some hydrology involved with ditching downhill like that and groundwater as well as negative?
I guess I'd have to know what you have. I can't imagine ditching groundwater down to a drain field. That's,
Well, no, well,
that's a big no-no.
let's say you're installing the septic fluid pipe from the tank.
Yeah.
To a drain field that is on someone else's property.
Yeah,
You know, digging that trench line, I thought was also kind of negative. You know, when you could have the site right at your house, you know, what's your, since you.
yeah. I helped write a standard in the septic system rules that if you have a line going from a septic tank to a drain field, say it's a pump station, and you dig a trench, I recommended that they put in either clay or synthetic boots. So what happens is, as the water goes from uphill down to your septic tank, you put some clay every so often down in the fill material. The groundwater coming down hits that and pops out of the ground. You get rid of it so it doesn't overwhelm your septic tank and pump station. So there are ways to address that, unless the pipe is backfilled with the same stuff that was dug out of the ground, and you won't get a short circuit of all that water.
Hopefully we won't have to worry about that anymore.
Yeah. Yes.
Maybe help us out in showing us how if you, so I think it's very clear about how it is that it would be good to have the system in part of the soil so that you get all the biological activity.
Mhm.
But the requirements he was talking about would say now also have to go to 36 inches. Was that 36 inches on top of that, or is that 36 inches downhill, or where, how does that put it in the top if it's 36?
The state septic system rules requires a 12-inch separation from the bottom of the drain field to the seasonal groundwater table in both soils. The one that was that, the one before that would be the soil pictures right there. This one here, it's got the hard pan where the olive color is, yeah, right there. That system right there would have to be built on top of the ground because the water table may be less than 12 inches. This one here, if the water table was at 4 feet, then you could technically put it into the ground 2 feet. The 36 inches that was chosen by, I guess you just figured that was a good number, or, I mean, I'm not sure where the 36 inches come from, because I wasn't part of the process, but the state rules say 12 inches. If the limiting factor is less than 15 inches, then the bottom of the leach field has to be 18 inches above that limiting factor. If you got a really poor soil with water table near the surface, you're gonna have a 2-foot separation. And because you need something that's aerobic to treat the wastewater, because not only do you not want to contaminate the groundwater table, but there's no place for the wastewater to go. Like I said, in that one here, there would just be no place to go, but it's gonna get treated even if it's in the water table. That one's not. So I don't know if that 36 inches is negotiable or what. Because there is a cost, obviously, in putting that much fill. Because on this side here, you'd have to put 2 feet of fill and 2 feet of system, so you'd have like a 4-foot high mound on the site like that.
So I would be able to build up 36 inches.
If it was a replacement septic system, you couldn't do that. If it was new, they wouldn't allow you to do that. But if it's replacement, if you got a slope on your land, you can either put in a diversion ditch or a curtain drain and lower that water table, intercept it so it's gone. And now, if there's a hard pan that perched that water, well, there are ways to get, you know, if depending on how big a watershed is coming down there, you can disperse that water right at the base of your drain field by putting in stone level spreaders or something. Spread the water back out into the ground because it always went there anyway. So you don't have to just put a ditch onto somebody else's land. You can spread the water out so it infiltrates back into the ground and then it reconnects like it was and doesn't have to impact somebody.
And a site evaluator would have to put together a plan that really looks at your specific circumstances, comes up with the design. Sounds like you would not be able to build a new system on that site. First time.
Yeah, it's not cheap anymore. But if you get a failing septic system, you don't have much choice. So if you get a new one, you should be kind to it and you should be okay. Any other questions? If not,
Thank you, Dave. So this is just, what we're looking at here is just some of the existing, this is a couple of septic systems that were designed last year, 2021, and installed in the summer. So these were approved by the Auburn Water District, but I just want to kind of go over this a little bit. So this one here has a limiting factor of 36 inches. This is a soil profile, soil horizon profile that the site evaluator does, and this is the limiting factor line right here. This is 30. I know it's hard to read, and this is 40. So it's right at 36 inches. These are the infiltrators that were installed, right? So this is ground level, right? This is a 24-inch cut. So even though we have that 36 inches, and Dave talked a little bit about this already, and I think it'll go back to your question about treatment and why we're suggesting that we do it on the surface, right? It's about polishing the water. It's about water quality here. We want these systems to be on the top, right? Because we know that if we wrote it as a constructor and we're building this and we're thinking about water quality, if we wrote it till this top duct layer and the strip away just the duct layer and then wrote it till this piece, that's where the most treatment occurs, right? Dave talked about that. That's where we're catching we're doing the best uptake in nutrients, right? Any of the roots or any of the available nutrients that are there, it picks up, it really eats that nitrogen, it eats that phosphorus, and it binds that in this layer right here. But if we're installing it down here, right, this is perfectly legal. But if we're doing this doesn't really do a lot for treating the water quality. It gets the water out. It's the percolation piece that Dave talked about at the beginning. And I think that if we go back to 1970, when originally this was written, that percolation was the big key, right? Then it wasn't treatment. It was okay science then, but the new science really is going to reflect treating from the top. So that's what we're suggesting. This one here, this is another one. This one's existing system replacement, only 10 inches, right? And if we look at that, it may be right at the limiting factor. So there could be times where this system's not functioning very well. I would have, if I was evaluating somebody's house, my recommendation would be, I don't necessarily like this design. I don't know how it's installed, but you could have overloading during the spring. This is a new system that just went in. It's passing. It meets the subsurface wastewater law. It meets the HHE 200. It meets the requirements in the watershed. But these are I wouldn't call this really good engineering, good construction. Bad investment for the taxpayers. You know, there's a lot of things here that are going on, and I think we can address them.
John and I talked some about that, and I think we will get pricing on systems to get the exact numbers, but when we had heard and just sort of taking a quick look at it, these systems could cost 10 to 30% more, but their lifespan could be 2 to 3 times as long. And that means less failures, less chance for nutrients to move away from the system when a failure happens. And if you can spend 20 or 30% more on something you need and have it last 2 to 3 times as long, it's not a bad investment for the homeowner. But we can get those numbers more firm in a later discussion.
If you go back to the other slide, Dave's slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about this. So Dave worked with me on this. These are some of the original numbers from that technical manual that really imparts what's considered dry swales and stormwater treatment. That's more my background in terms of treating stormwater, working for an engineering firm. Dave imparted, hey, John, you got a couple of things wrong on this based on the recommendation. And increasing the size, these are the sizes of the fines. Increasing those amounts make a better treatment for wastewater, so for septic system. So that's really the specifics of that additional 2 feet of material that we're talking about that we'd introduced. And this can be replicated relatively easily by local site contractors through aggregates that can be found here in Auburn. So this is really the field example that I came up with for the 12 inches. So this is our limiting factor right here, this line, right? We're stripping some of the topsoil, we're rototilling this in, and then we're adding our 2 feet of material, and then we're putting the treatment on top. So that's kind of a profile of what that would look like. Yeah, there's all kinds of proprietary devices out there. Elgins or, there's septic, bioseptics. There's many kinds. These particular ones are concrete chambers, precast concrete chambers that they put in. So there's all kinds of different types. And this is on the top here, it's kind of a profile. They kind of beat me up a little bit about some of the subsoil and some of that, but I wanted people to understand that this is really, at the end of the day, these new systems will be mounted systems, right? They're going to sit on top of the ground, and they will be mounted. And in a lot of circumstances, it's going to require a pump, right, to get the effluent to the field. So that's kind of a profile of what that would look like. And this is our, we talked a little bit about our curtain drain on the uphill side, right? We want to stop that groundwater from them infiltrating there. We're doing the best we can to protect the septic system. So, yeah, so this is the septic tank, right? And the bottom is the sludge, the top is the scum. So essentially, you have on the down gradient side, you have what's called the sanitary tee, shaped like this, and that pipe goes out. You're grabbing the effluent in between, which is called the scum layers on the top, the solids, sludge is on the bottom. You're grabbing the effluent. The effluent is pushed up hydraulically into the pump station. Then when the pump station gets to a certain height, then it kicks on and it pushes water into the field treatment. So that's kind of how that works.
This kind of site evaluator, it's a new lot they have to build on. Pump station cost $1,500 to $2,000. As a site evaluator, I tell people on new lots, if they were going to have to pump, if they wanted to spend $1,500 on fill, build a house up a little higher, then they could gravity. It wouldn't cost them any more, and they won't have to maintain a pump for it. If you're already there existing, there isn't much you can do. You're not gonna jack your house up. But for new lots, you can get pretty cheap fill to build that house up enough to avoid having to pump it and landscape it in. So that doesn't have to be a big issue for new lots. For replacements, it's a little tough.
That's a great point. Yep, great. So that's pretty much, that's the design. And then again, we talked about this at the beginning, the follow-up, years 2, 4, and 6. If it gets to a point that, well, we push it to a point where there is development in the watershed, how much has occurred? How many existing sites did you correct? What are the types of BMPs that are implemented? And then let's quantify the phosphorus, the nitrogen, the nitrates trapped in the watershed. Right, so 319, Dean talked a little bit about this, soil water conservation districts. They did a lot of 319 work in watersheds, right? And their responsibility to report back to DEP on the quantification of the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen and nitrates that are trapped in these best management practices. We suggest we do the same thing, right? We want to track what we're doing. I think it's important. It's our responsibility to do that. And I think that, we have the leadership's support. We brought this presentation in front of our senior leadership at the city, and they have our support in this. So following up will be important.
But according to our Lake Auburn study, it says that they do not recommend increased density in the lake. You have to worry about
Any other question?
Well, you can't talk about the water quality. Talking about Bill. Not only about water. Big move on. You mentioned a lot of this pressure. Augusta, it is 1448. Pickford, Philly. Percentage of income. Get around that. That's pressure coming from here. Realize that. Also, there's a lot of pressure from developers, a lot of pressure from hiring people in city government to build it. We have to. This is breakneck kind of stuff. The whole community. Quality of our life is a big here. I've been to about 6 of these hearings. I can tell you that almost all the testimony from people, because we don't want too rapid. Also tell you that city council that understood that. A new city council, new planning board, and they're not listening. They're not listening. And everyone here should understand that. Water, city. Also, the whole quality of life is right now pretty darn high. That's why we're here. Don't get involved. There's going to be a rapid change in commercial buildings. And it's going to be difficult for all of us.
We're getting feedback online that people can't hear us, so we'll pass the mic around if there's going to be comments.
I had
And
two
this is,
comments.
and I
I
just
just had
want to
two
respond
comments.
just for a minute. I'll let you, and then I'll let you go. I'll give you the mic. This really tonight is about septic systems, and I think that what you're talking about is a valid point. But again, we're getting, this is, I think, a way in terms of planning, this is the best way we can defend what we have out there in terms of our public water supply, right? And I think that this is I feel good about this one, that it's easy to talk about and it's easy to defend, but this is our best step forward. And at least this particular part of the ordinance that addresses an issue that's out. I'm not saying that what you're saying is not valid or not. And there's other pressures, and I understand that. But this is an opportunity for us to make some headway on what I think is an issue in the ordinance. So we're gonna let this clear.
I think it's great that there may be new septic system technology, and I wish that this meeting had been restricted just to that. But you introduced a couple of other things, and that's why you're getting a response. And you mentioned that we're getting pressure from Augusta. LD 1884 is a bill that was designed to be an end run around the years that Auburn has spent looking at the ag zone and figuring out what to do. It's supported by Auburn's mayor. If he said he did not want that bill to pass, it would be dead. So we have only our city mayor to blame if that comes down on us. Secondly, phosphorus design and plans are only as good as the city's ability to monitor and implement whatever is necessary for enforcement purposes on a continuous basis. And I don't see in there, when you talk about looking studies 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, that there is also the will to have the city have the money that's needed and the authority to make sure continuously that plans are followed. Thank you. You probably get it anyway.
John, what advice do you have for a resident within the watershed who has let's say, a septic system that is edging towards failure?
If it's edging towards failure, then, getting a site evaluator to take a look at it is probably your first step. They're the licensed folks that are gonna address your issue, right? They may say that, it's the end of its useful life and it needs to be replaced, or they may not. I don't know in any particular case, what the recommendation might be, but I'd always start with the licensed professional in this particular case and go to them and get their recommendation.
One of the things that we're looking at putting together for possibly this summer is we have an opportunity for a couple of Muskie School students, and we're looking to put together a project that takes the data we have on existing houses and tries to fill in the gaps on when systems were last replaced, and potentially starts reaching out to people to understand when they were last pumped and understand the maintenance and condition of some of those. And that would give us a good baseline to over time better track what is the improvement of replacing these systems at the higher standard, knowing what we start.
I can help answer some of that question as a site evaluator. And as a person who's worked in that program for many years, is if you have a septic system that's borderline, the state right now just says it either failed or it didn't. There's no borderline. But anyway, if it is, then if it's kind of a conventional design, was it overused? Has a growing family, maybe use it a little too hard. If that's the case, you can introduce oxygen into that leach field because you got this biomat that's too thick. That will reduce its thickness and allow it to percolate better. So if the system is an old who knows what, you probably got to just replace it. But if it's a system since 1974, we've been designing systems by site evaluation. It's progressed over the years, but if you've got a system that's been designed since 1974 and it wasn't stuck down in the water table or on top of hot and something like that, you may be able to renovate it. or expand it. If it's a stone bed, you might add another 15 feet of it because you're using more water. So the answer to that isn't just you've got to replace it. Sometimes you can fix it or expand it.
Thank you. This has all been very interesting, and one of the things that I'm glad to keep the focus on the lake as a public water supply for the people of two cities and even the part of Poland, in fact. So it seems to me an important part of this. Don't know how much of the Lewiston Water Department is here, but it does seem to me that we collectively have a responsibility to help people in Lewiston understand what we're doing here too, since we are, in fact, when you think about stakeholders, we have 2 hospitals, 2 colleges, every resident has some reason, whether you have a well in your backyard, everybody drinks public water some point in their life in this community. You go to the library, you get a drink of water. You go to a restaurant, you're going to be drinking water, most likely that has Lake Auburn as its source. So when you think about how we move forward with some of the changes that you're considering, many of which sound incredibly intelligent, and I'm happy to hear about them in greater detail, is to help people in both communities and even the part of Poland that counts on us to understand what we're doing, so it is a collaborative process. I think it's a really important responsibility that we have together. The lake is in Auburn, but it is a source of drinking water for far greater span. And in fact, in my time as a former water district trustee, we had a chance to hear from people throughout the region well beyond Lewiston Auburn, because we're a service center city. We have people who come here to shop, enjoy each other. We like this, right? We want people to come here. And so we have pretty wide stakeholders all around who need to make sure that they're understanding what we're doing here with the water that they're all counting on. So whatever you're doing, Water District of Lewiston, if you're here tonight, I'm glad. I hope you have a chance to ask all your questions, if not in the public setting, in a private setting, and really have the detailed opportunity to understand what is being proposed. So thank you for an excellent presentation. Final thing is there a way to get copies of the slides? I'm not an expert on septic.
And Mary, just for clarity for people listening, we do have representatives from Auburn Water District, Lewiston Water District, and the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission here tonight. And we've spoken at the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission last week, encouraging both Lewiston Water and the Protection Commission to attend, as well as inviting the Auburn Water.
Yeah, the slides are actually available on the web, on the City of Auburn's webpage, and it's on the front page. And it's community discussions, and it's the exact slides that we showed tonight. I got one more slide, and we'll take some more questions. I see you guys raising your hands. These are kind of our next steps. So we are going to have another conversation, pretty much the same presentation, again on March 2nd. We're going to workshop this presentation and the materials. Dave's going to grill me some more on my septic design because I'm a rookie. And then we're going to present to the planning board in a public hearing on the 12th. And then potentially council readings, if everything goes as planned, April 18th and then May 2nd. So this is kind of the layout as what we see to get this, just the septic systems, this portion that I presented tonight through an ordinance update, just so everybody knows.
And the low impact development standards and phosphorus controls are ahead of that, and we'll be going to the city council on March 7th.
Hi, I am here for the Lewiston Water District and Public Works Director. And I really love all the education that we got tonight. There really is a lot of good standards and a lot of good science and education. And my burning question has been that, you know, with the current, it's mostly agricultural zone around the lake. And with the current zoning rules, is there 100 buildable lots if we get a better septic system where they could do mound systems? I mean, is there good lots out there? I'd love to see a map on that. Because I think it is a better design. I've had systems like that before. But I'm not sure where they are in the zone because I just learned so much about the agricultural zones having minimum lot sizes and all that.
So that's a good question, and that really brings up kind of what Dave and I and Eric was talking a little bit about this. If we go at the next level, what can we do, right? And what's best for the watershed? This hasn't been vetted at all through the council or the senior leadership. This is just a thought process, but it's introducing net residential development. But what does that mean? And we're already trying to quantify that. We're working with Rosemary on GIS layers, and we're quantifying slopes, right? So look, that's a limiting factor on design. So slopes greater than a certain percentage. Is it 10%? Is it 15? Is it 20 based on subsurface wastewater law? Subsurface wastewater law says anything greater than 20 is a no-go. Scantic soils, right? Anything that's really wet, clay soils, that's a no-go. Wetlands, no-go. So you start eliminating all this stuff, and then you come out with the land that's available, right? And then of that lot, there's got to be a percentage that is available for good construction. We talked a little bit about introducing LID techniques. We have to be able to implement those things on those new lots to make it a good development for the watershed. So I think those are some of the considerations we might have. This was internal professional staff discussions that how we might address that. I'm not saying that that's going to be the end state. We may get a different direction on that, but that may be our best step forward in maybe allowing some development in the watershed. And that's how it would be the most responsible way that I've seen people do it. They've done it in Warren. College friend of mine is the kind of the economic and community development director there and the planner. And that's what they're doing. They've got some of the same challenges that Auburn does, and that's what they're doing. So.
So I just want to bring to everybody's attention, I pass this out to people. It does say, as I mentioned it before, all right, so phosphorus comes to the water, according to this study, by taking trees off the land. And so when you deforest, it's a huge way of phosphorus getting into the water. And when you build a lot, you deforest. So the recommendation here was to consider portions of the watershed, to not consider portions of the watershed for increased density. Increased density and new opportunities are better suited in other areas of Auburn, and that's on page 63. Another one on the page 55. In summary, expanding development in Lake Auburn watershed provides minimal net economic benefit across all affected stakeholders. And there's a couple of other places in here. So I think that, I realize that there's going to be, I can think of Eric Gould. I mean, he has a beautiful piece that, that's his property, and I can understand that he would build on his own property. I get that. But to make it so that you're going to increase development is not good for the lake. And this study says it. Now, should people who, I hope my septic system doesn't break down. I'm going to be at the $30,000. I totally agree that we should have higher standards for our septic systems. I do, and this is what really worries me about the city, is that this is your first step, like the strip zoning is your first step. And then you know, this is like a slippery slope. I hope this isn't it. That if you're gonna be able to do this, and all of a sudden, oh, now we can develop around the lake, and that should not happen. That should not happen.
My backyard. This is an issue for Lewiston and Auburn. It's a big issue.
So my question was just about, so solely on the wastewater and the LIDs. If this does go through at the council level, does this give us an effective way to also have the watershed north of Auburn also start some of that stuff? Because a lot of contaminants will also flow down outside of Auburn to us. So I know we can only do so much within our border, but will this also help us, kind of, I don't want to say force, but help us enforce watershed that we don't actually have purview over all the way?
The city doesn't have any authority to do that. That's something we could work with the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission on. But I do think that because this standard can be met by altering the soil profile and bringing soil in, maybe there's a better shot of convincing other towns that it could work for them. I don't think we have any shot of convincing other towns, nor would we want to, based on treatment that occurs that in systems where you have to find the 36 inches on site, or else there's no. This provides, I think, a higher level of environmental protection, but also a little more flexibility to physically meet those standards on a site that has soils that are not the 36 inches. The city can't do that, but we can certainly work with the district and the protection commission to have those discussions.
Did not the planning board at the meeting last week vote to redistrict the area around Grace Lawn and the old dump so that there can be development? And if that's so, is the next step to go to the city council? And it might get voted yes by them. So should we be stepping up and doing something if we're not in favor of that? And what would you suggest? Call a councilman? What do we do?
One of the other recommendations of that Lake Auburn watershed study was that based on the information that we have about groundwater movements and the change in topography that has happened in the Grace Lawn gravel pits, that part of the city, even though we had it mapped on our zoning map as part of the watershed, does not drain towards Lake Auburn. So yes, the planning board did recommend that we move the boundary of our Lake Auburn watershed protection overlay to match what we believe is the actual boundary of the Lake Auburn watershed. And also to change the zoning to allow that pit to be used for something else when the gravel value is. No, so that is something that was first generated in the 2010 comprehensive plan. It was under different ownership at that time. And the updated plan used new data from groundwater monitoring that we've collected over the years, both from the Auburn landfill and from the gravel pits. And the FB environmental study drew a more exact watershed boundary, but the concept has been in our comp plan since 2010.
I think you could probably answer this question. What is the plan in terms of testing for the forever chemicals? Is there a schedule?
So I don't know any schedule. I've been curious about that too, when we might start to see some results from Maine Department of Environment. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. There certainly will be testing for PFAS on the sites that have had sludge spread out over the years, but it'll be a state test. I really don't know.
I kind of find it ironic that all of us sitting here, I believe, are from the watershed area. Is there anybody who's not from the watershed area? Okay, we have a few. And we've been asked, and rightly so, and I've had some good experience in the city of Auburn as far as my new septic system a number of years ago. I was on a cesspool. Excuse me, we were on a cesspool, and it wasn't broken and it worked, so we left it alone. Now, we're hearing these things that are changing, and we are going to have to modify, monitor, etc., all of our properties, which we need to do to protect the water that we don't consume as the residents of that area. How many people here have a well? How many here don't have a well? Okay. Although I would think, maybe you can answer this question, both you two gentlemen in the front. I'm assuming that any runoff we have on our property would eventually get to the wells that we are drinking from, but not to the capacity that would be affected by those affluents that go in Lake Auburn. So it's kind of ironic. We're doing the job of protecting the water. But I suppose we need to do it because we can always move. Yeah, and I suppose just said, who else is going to do it? Exactly. So we kind of have been, I know we all appreciate living in the watershed. It's a totally different area up there. We live in North Auburn, and we always say North Auburn. We don't say Auburn because it is very, very distinct. But I think we have a particular responsibility. I would not like the cost. I remember when we had our new septic system put in. My fellow in green did a fabulous job, and we had the curtain put in and all the other things. It was $7,000 at the time, which back then was a lot of money. Now it'd probably be a drop in the bucket, bit dirty. But anyway, I think we have a responsibility, and I think the city is trying to do what's good for everybody, but giving us the chance to, talk into it. Anyway, thank you.
I just mentioned to you that actuality, the new design, there's a bigger potential for contaminating your well by the septic system design that's in the ordinance today by far than the lake, because the lake is further away. It takes a long time to get there. I personally investigated a number of people who had contaminated wells with sewage that were in sandy, gravelly soils with septic systems. So this new design is actually going to be better for well owners than it is actually for the lake, although it all gets there, but it'll get diluted with that distance. So it's good for you too.
So I'm somebody who spent quite a bit of time studying Lake Auburn and studying phosphorus loading into Lake Auburn. And I'm really pleased to see the recommendation that you all are making that anytime a septic system needs to be renovated, that it be renovated to a higher standard to help limit loading into the lake. I think with respect to thinking about new development, I would suggest that those trends that you were showing with respect to turbidity, those are being driven by, yes, potentially leaking current systems, but they're also being driven by new development, and they're being driven by increased variability and extreme storm events. And so to the extent that what we're seeing is a changing climate that's going to have more of these extreme storm events, more of these rain on snow events, those are all things that are going to be bringing more phosphorus into the lake. And so it seems to me that if we're thinking about limiting that, and that really is the top priority here, then we ought to be asking, how else are we going to do this? And certainly any low impact development is a good way to think about that.
But no development and leaving it in forest is actually even less likely to bring more phosphorus into the lake. And so I appreciate that you're looking at things like what is the land cover and how might development look on the landscape, and let's take the wetlands out of it, and let's take the high water table out. But you can also go another step and say, how is it that any kind of development would change phosphorus loading to the lake? Or how would it change nitrogen loading to the lake? I think you actually need to be thinking about both nitrogen and phosphorus. And so I would, the best and easiest thing to do is simply not develop the watershed any further. The report is actually quite clear that that the watershed is already at what they consider a boundary, a tipping point, if you will, for how much forest there should or shouldn't be to limit the amount of phosphorus going into the lake. They suggest that 75% forest is a good boundary. We're already right there. Any additional clearance for any additional development is going to drive that in the wrong direction relative to water quality. So I find myself hoping that as part of your assessment that you're doing, that you're actually asking not just about how much could be developed, but what would be the impacts of any additional development? Because it doesn't appear to me that the lake can really withstand any additional development.
If there are no other questions, that's everything that we had for tonight. The schedule is here. I do want to mention that what came up, you said it over here, City Council will consider the zoning changes that the planning board recommended at their last meeting at the March 7th City Council meeting, and planning board will be on March 8th, the day after this coming month. Our website will be updated with all the materials as we approach those meetings. March 7th, the city council meeting. So there will be, yes, there will be a public hearing and a public reading of rezoning changes that night. The Gracelawn area, Washington Street, and the phosphorus standards.
Yeah. Snow was different.
Thank you.
That's good.
Another good day for you. This evening.
This is